Relax and listen to the voice. Well, alright everyone. It's been a little while, so we've come back to these. Short, creepy, and scary stories. These are bite-sized tales, and this episode will be jam-packed full of them. Here we go. There was once a nun who was on her way to midnight mass. She was driving down a lonely country road, and it was very dark outside, and she was worried as it seemed to be getting later and later. She kissed the rosary beads around her neck and said a prayer. She glanced at her car's radio clock and saw that it was exactly 12 a.m. When she looked back at the road, she saw a tall, dark figure standing there with his thumb sticking out. She was about to drive past this person, but she thought she could use some company, so she pulled over to the side of the road. The man walked over to her car and opened the door. He was very tall and thin, and his face was pale white. He wore a huge overcoat and a big black hat. "Do you want to ride?" she asked the man. He looked down upon her and smiled. "Why, sure. Where are you going?" "I'm heading to church for midnight mass," she said. "Are you going that way?" "Thereabouts," the man said to her as he got into the back seat of the car. "Thanks for stopping. Usually no one stops for hitchhikers this late at night." The nun smiled and drove on down the road. On the way, she told the man all about her life and her faith. He listened and he laughed once in a while. As the church came into view, he leaned forward and asked her to stop. "Are you sure?" said the nun. "I could take you a little farther." As he got out, he replied, "No, I'll be good right here. I'll walk. Actually, I have someone coming for me, right near this spot." "Are you sure?" she asked, as she had seemed to like his company. "No, but thank you for the ride, Clarice." He smiled at her and then walked down the road. Shortly after that, she thought, "That's strange. I don't recall telling him my name." She got out of her car and looked down at the tracks that he left and screamed. Where the man's footprint should have been, there were hoof prints. She drove into Busby, arrived at the church, and told the priest about what had happened. She showed him her car, and in the back seat, there was a devil's sign. The next morning, she was found dead in her car, right where she had dropped the hitchhiker off. Bonjour and hello to everyone. I come from France. I live in a suburb of Paris with my wife, Sabine. We met in a nightclub just a few months ago, really. When I saw her lithe figure on the dance floor, she took my breath away. I never ever believed in love at first sight, but as I watched her slow, graceful movements as she danced, I knew that she had to be my wife. Sabine is a deeply passionate woman. She's highly sensual, sultry, and very seductive. However, she also had a dark side. Sometimes she was loving and caring and did everything in her power to please me. At other times, she could be cold-blooded and cruel, with a quick and poisonous tongue. Sabine wore her emotions on her sleeve, and that could be quite a handful. When we actually began seeing each other, I had to learn to adjust to her moods. Within the space of a few minutes, she could go from quiet, pleasant and relaxed, to loud, angry, and vicious. I had to be careful, because it seemed like even the slightest thing could set her off. We'd only been dating for about a month when I asked her to marry me. My friends told me that I was rushing into things, but I was honestly worried that some other guy would come along and sweep her off of her feet. In the days and weeks after the wedding, we were absolutely inseparable. Often, we would spend the morning cuddling in bed. Sabine would coil herself around me and lay gentle kisses all over my neck. However, it wasn't long before her attitude towards me began to change. She grew sullen and withdrawn and started pressuring me to have children. I told her that I thought it was too soon, and said that I thought we should wait until our financial situation was better, but Sabine was incorrigible. All she talked about was having babies. It was like she was obsessed or something. "What should we name our children?" she asked one day as I was trying to read the newspaper. "I don't know," I replied, just a little bit irritated. "I haven't even thought about it that much." "Well, I have," said Sabine. "If we have boys, I'll call them Simon, Sylvester, Seymour, Stephen, and Cedric. And if they're girls, I'll call them Solange, Sylvia, Sandrine, Suzanne, Selena, and Cynthia." I nodded my head, didn't really reply, just kind of returned to my newspaper. One hot afternoon in the middle of summer, Sabine and I were lying on deck chairs, sunning ourselves on the terrace. I glanced over at my beautiful wife, and I noticed something odd about the skin on her legs. It looked like it was peeling off. I piped up about it and said, "Sabine, you're getting burned." I reached out and I put my hand on her thigh. Her skin felt rough and scaly. She didn't really respond, she just kind of lazily groaned back. "Don't worry, darling, it's nothing." "It's not nothing, Sabine," I said. "I want you to see the doctor about this skin condition of yours. I'm worried. This could be something serious." The next morning, despite my wife's protests, I accompanied her to the dermatologist. He examined her for a while, but couldn't figure out what was wrong. However, he assured us that it was not serious and it would probably clear up on its own. He gave Sabine a balm to apply to her skin twice a day, and he advised her to stay out of the sun for the time being. On the way home, we passed a pet store. Sabine urged me to stop, and she stared through the shop window. I saw that her face broke out into a smile. "Oh, look, Sebastian," she exclaimed. "They're so cute." I raised my eyebrows when I saw what she was pointing at. It was a cage full of white mice. They were crawling all over each other, and the sight of their flesh-colored tails swinging back and forth, it just kind of sent a chill down my spine. I thought it was a completely hideous sight, but before I could object, my wife was already entering the store. "Wait, Sabine, we can't." "Oh, stop being such a killjoy," she cried. "There'll be so much fun for our children to play with." "Sabine, we don't have any kids." She stopped and burst into tears. "Oh, come on, Sabine, calm down. Everyone's watching us." I tried to hug her, but she wriggled out of my grasp and pushed me away. "Don't you touch me," she cried. "I know that you don't love me. That's why you refuse to have children with me." I tried to reassure her in a soft voice, telling her that I loved her more than ever, but it was no use. She remained angry and brooded wordlessly until I finally relented and took out my wallet. The pet shop owner handed me a cage and a box with holes in the side. By the time we left, Sabine was smiling again. It was as if we had never argued. An hour later, we arrived home with the white mice. I placed the cage on a dressing table in our bedroom and put the scurrying creatures inside. They ran to and fro, exploring their new home. I counted 1, 2, 3, 4... a total of 18 white mice. It was too much. I sighed and I went to the bathroom. I decided I would take a cold bath to try and relieve my mind of the stresses that had happened all day. After about a half an hour, I got out. I dried myself and I returned to the bedroom to put on my clothes. When I passed by the cage, I saw the mice still scurrying around and sniffing with their noses in the air. For some reason, I counted them again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Strangely enough, there were only 17 white mice. Either I miscounted, or one must have escaped. I searched the room, I looked high and low, but I couldn't find any sign of a mouse. "Sabine! Sabine!" I called out. "I think one of the mice got out of the cage." There was no reply. When I went looking for my wife, I found her lying on the terrace, basking in the sun. "Sabine, what are you doing?" I cried. "The doctor told you not to go out in the sun. What about your skin?" She lowered her sunglasses and stared up at me with a venomous look. "Can't you let me be?" she hissed, and then she turned over, yawned, and stretched out like a lizard would on a rock. I shrugged my shoulders. At this point, I was too tired to argue with her anymore, so I lay down beside her on a deck chair. Before long, I must have dozed off. When I awoke, the sun was setting, and Sabine's deck chair was empty. I was alone on the terrace. Rubbing my eyes, I got up and I walked to the bedroom. Pausing at the door, I peeked inside and I saw Sabine sitting cross-legged on our bed. The cage was at her feet, and the top lay open. As I watched, she licked her lips and reached inside. Picking up one of the white mice, my wife held the tiny creature up above her, dangling it by the tail. And then, to my horror, she threw back her head, opened her jaw wide, and dropped the mouse into her mouth. I watched her lips close around it, engulfing the mouse, and she began to chew. I could literally hear its tiny bones crunching between her teeth, and then with one big gulp, she swallowed the mouse whole. I held my hand to my mouth, trying to stifle a scream, and also trying not to vomit. Despite my efforts, I accidentally let a little squeak slip out, and she turned to look at me. Her eyes grew wide with surprise. "Sebastian," she hissed. "Sorry, sweetheart. You weren't supposed to see that." Before I could say the word, she pounced on me like a coiled spring and wrapped her arms and legs around my body. She began squeezing me, like actually crushing my torso between her supple limbs. I struggled desperately, and I was unable to breathe. It felt like all the air was being squeezed out of my lungs. I felt like I was starting to lose consciousness. Before I blacked out, I managed to free one of my hands, and I reached out to grab the first thing that I could lay my hands on. It was a lamp. I pulled my arm back and I began beating Sabine over the head with it, and I guess due to the pressure being put on me and the exertion, I passed out. Everything went black. When I woke up, I found myself lying on the floor. Sabine's dead body lay beside me, her head soaked in blood. I panicked and I burst into tears. I grabbed her and picked her body up. I cradled her head in my arms for a few minutes, and then I composed myself and I called the police. When the police arrived and took a look at the scene, they arrested me. Initially, they planned to charge me with murder, but when they did an autopsy, they discovered the contents of my wife's stomach. 5 partially digested white mice. They realized that I was telling the truth, or at least they thought I was telling a portion of the truth. And in the end, the police believed that Sabine had gone insane, and possibly, thinking that she was a snake, tried to crush me and eat me alive. They closed the case and released me without a charge, and I was allowed to go home. When I reached the house, it felt sad, lonely, and extremely depressed. The place was so empty without Sabine. Despite what had happened, I still loved her, and I blamed myself for her death. If I'd only known that she was losing her mind, perhaps I could have saved her. Going upstairs to the bedroom, I took off my shirt and pants. I wanted to take a cold bath and just forget about everything. It was just then that I noticed the cage. It was empty, and all the white mice were gone. I looked around the room, but there was no trace of them. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed that the bedsheets were kind of moving and undulating. With shaking hands, I reached out and I pulled back the bedspread. Underneath, there were several little babies, slithering back and forth over the sheets. They all turned their heads and looked up at me with blazing red eyes. Their mouths opened and their forked tongues poked out, as they said in unison, "We miss you, Daddy." There was an old man who loved practical jokes. Whenever he played a prank on someone, he would get a great sense of satisfaction from seeing the shocked look on their faces. He enjoyed making people scream with fright and almost jump out of their skin in surprise. The man's wife was constantly telling him off. She was tired of his childish pranks and felt that he should grow up and behave more responsibly. Nothing that she said ever seemed to make the slightest bit of difference, and she generally wound up as the butt of his jokes. As time went by, the man grew bored with the same old practical jokes. His pranks grew more elaborate and more daring, and he was always looking for ideas for more tricks to play on other people. One day, as he was driving to work, he passed by an alleyway beside a large department store. Something caught his eye, and he brought the car to a screeching halt. There, lying in a dumpster, was a female mannequin. It was disassembled, and the arms and legs were sticking out at odd angles. The man suddenly had a great idea for a prank. He got out of his car, and he went over to the dumpster. He reached in and pulled the mannequin's head out of the trash. It was in good shape. Apart from a scratch on the nose and a few other dents, the mannequin looked almost lifelike. Working quickly before anyone spotted him, he gathered the arms, legs, and torso and loaded them into the boot of his car. He spent the day in his office, plotting his next great prank. He was so excited, he couldn't wait to pull it off. That evening, he drove home, ate dinner with his wife and son, and then excused himself and went to bed early. The next morning at 6 a.m., his alarm went off. He shut it off quickly so as to not wake his wife and son. The house was completely silent as he quietly crept downstairs and let himself into the garage. Opening the boot of his car, he unloaded the pieces of the mannequin and propped them up against the wall. Then the man searched through some old boxes and pulled out a dark hooded robe and a demonic-looking Halloween face mask. He laid the limbs of the dummy out on the floor and assembled it, carefully screwing the arms and the legs into the torso. Finally, he screwed the head on tightly and dressed the mannequin in the dark robe and the mask. He proceeded to pick it up and carry it into the house. He made his way upstairs, careful not to make any noise, and he opened his son's bedroom door. In the dim light, he could see his son lying in bed, fast asleep. The man cautiously placed the mannequin beside his son's bed. He took a few steps back to marvel at his mischievous creation. He was pleased, but the mannequin seemed to be lacking something. It just wasn't quite as scary as he had imagined. And just then it came to him. He crept downstairs to the kitchen and he grabbed a large steak knife from the drawer. Going back upstairs, he placed a sharp knife in the mannequin's hand and posed its arm as if it were bringing the knife down in a stabbing motion. He once again eyed his creation, and he had to put his hand over his mouth to stop the laughter. He could almost just see his son's reaction when he woke up, and noticed the frightening mannequin standing over him, poised to strike. This might be his greatest prank yet. Brimming with anticipation, he tiptoed back downstairs and made himself a cup of coffee. Later that morning, the man was sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast when his wife came in and said good morning to him. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table beside him. He had a smug look on his face. He just knew that his son would be waking up any minute now, and he could hardly wait. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream broke the silence, and his wife dropped her cup of coffee. She was about to run up the stairs when she was stopped by her husband's laughter. "What is so funny?" she asked rather angrily. "Looks like our son has fallen victim to my latest prank," the man said as he chuckled contentedly. His wife rolled her eyes and returned to the chair. "You made me drop my coffee, you know that? This isn't funny." They sat in the kitchen, waiting for their son to come downstairs. But after 5 minutes of silence, they both grew impatient. "Would you please go up and check on him?" asked the wife. "He'll be late for school." The man smiled and walked upstairs. He opened his son's door and he looked inside. Suddenly, he froze, and all the color drained from his face. His son lay on his bed. Blood pooled all around his neck and shoulders. The steak knife that his father had placed in the hand of the mannequin was embedded in his chest. After the police had shown up and done their investigation, they seemed to settle on the idea that the son had woken up, and in his fright, due to being startled by the mannequin, he flailed his arms and dislodged the knife from the mannequin's hands. The knife then dropped directly down, plunged into his chest, and pierced his heart. It was late in the evening, and a man was on his way home from work. He thought he was the only passenger on the bus, but then he heard children's voices coming from behind him. As he listened to their conversation, he began to become intrigued. The two boys were apparently talking about a ghost story. "And if you turn around, the ghost will snatch you away and carry you off to the afterworld," he heard one of the boys say. The man recognized the boy's voice. He had often seen the kids on the same bus when he traveled home from work every day. He believed that they attended a school nearby. The other boy was saying, "That's easy then. All you have to do is make sure that you don't turn around." "Well, yeah," replied the first boy. "But the thing is, you can't help but turn around. The ghost will try all sorts of tricks to get you to turn around." The man realized that they were getting close to the stop where the two boys usually got off. However, it appeared to him that they didn't seem to notice. When the bus stopped, the kids were still talking. The man thought that he should warn them that they were about to miss their stop, so he turned around. The man was never seen again. I went out for a ride on my motorcycle on a gray Sunday afternoon. I went down a lonely country road. I was miles away from anywhere, and the weather started looking bad. Not very much longer after that, I got caught in a pretty intense freak storm. The rain was pelting down, and there was no place for me to take shelter out there. I kept riding carefully, and then I saw up ahead, not that far from the road I was on, a large house that seemed to be deserted. It was an old chateau, and the walls were covered in poison ivy. It looked like most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was obvious that it had been empty for a number of years. Just then, I made a snap decision, and I decided to take shelter inside of it, and when I tried the front door, I was surprised to find that it was unlocked. When I got inside, there was a stale odor of damp and rotting wood. The house had a really eerie feeling that made me feel a little bit uneasy. For some reason, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up on end. As I began to strip off my riding coat and shake the rain off of my body, I looked down, and I happened to notice an odd trail in the dust that looked quite recent. It looked like something or someone had been dragged down the hallway. The strangest thing was that there were no footprints in the dust, just weird drag marks. There was an old coat hanging on the end of the staircase. Picking it up, I took a look at the worn and moth-eaten garment. In the back of the coat, there was a small hole, and the area around it was scorched and stained. I know I was feeling a little off about this house, but to me, this looked something like a bullet hole. It gave me the creeps. Did this mean that, at one time, the coat had been worn by a dead man? There was also a stale odor of dampness and mold coming from that old coat. Something felt wrong inside of me, and I got the feeling that it might be more than just mold from water. There was a putrid smell of rotten decay all around this banister where the coat sat. If I didn't know better, I would have said that it was the stench of decomposing flesh. Standing there in the hallway, a sudden feeling of danger came over me, but with a slight shudder, and thinking that I needed to be rational, I brushed it off. Even though I was able to brush it off, the whole atmosphere of this place seemed to just be charged up with an evil energy. I went into the living room and I tried to start a fire. While I was piling some damp wood into the fireplace, I kept trying to pull myself together, and I told myself that there was nothing to be frightened of. Even though this old chateau was creepy, and I wouldn't want to spend the night here, it was better than getting drenched in the driving rain. It was just then that I was startled by the sound of movement coming from the hallway. There was a single soft flop, as if something had dropped to the ground. I froze in place and I strained my ears to listen, but I couldn't move, and there was no further sound after that initial plop. After a couple seconds, I began creeping quietly over to the door. I looked out. I saw that there was nothing in the hallway, and the only thing that I could hear was the sound of the heavy rain outside. Then I noticed something strange. The old coat that had been hanging at the end of the stairs was gone. A chill crept down my spine, and I had the strange feeling that I was no longer alone in this house. Just then, I heard a low, evil chuckle echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of a stealthy movement. I spun around quickly, just in time to see a shapeless black mass rise up behind me. It was the coat. The empty sleeves of this coat jerked grotesquely at its sides as it slowly moved towards me. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. As the thing advanced, I took a step backwards until I bumped against the fireplace. Those empty sleeves reached out as if they were trying to grab at my throat. I spun and I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, and I swung it with all my might, lashing out at the thing in front of me. As soon as I struck it, the coat collapsed to the ground in a heap. I fled from the room immediately, and I ran out the front door as fast as I could. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw a black shape on the doorstep. I could have sworn that it was the coat, lying there, watching me escape. I grabbed my bike, started pushing it, jumped on, and got it running, and I didn't stop until I came to a small country pub by the side of the road. When I walked in, I saw a group of men there. I was glad, and I ordered a drink to steady my nerves. I cautiously asked the landlord if he knew anything about the old deserted house. After a while, he told me that it had once been occupied by a man who was a staff sergeant in the army. Those who knew the man said that he was the meanest man ever to walk the earth. Apparently, they say there were tales that he had murdered his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, including his own daughters. In the end, the landlord said that one of the daughters couldn't take the abuse any longer and wound up shooting him in the back with his own gun. I was out in the country in England, at a country pub, sitting at the bar one night, when a strange little man walked in and sat up on a bar stool at the other end of the counter. He ordered a beer and began telling the barman a story. As I listened in, I heard him talking about how he had been out mountain climbing with his friend and they had ran into some trouble. He said that his friend's rope broke and that his friend fell hundreds of feet to his death. The little man said he had been stuck on a small outcropping on the sheer mountain face with no way down and no hope of rescue. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said, but did you just say that you were stranded on the sheer face of a cliff with no way to get down and no hope of being rescued? Quite right, said the little man. So if you're telling the truth, then you couldn't have gotten down, and you couldn't have been rescued, correct? Quite right, said the little man. So, I guess, according to that logic, you're either dead or your whole story is a big lie, I said with a smirk on my face. Quite right, said the little man, and then he vanished into thin air. One evening, a taxi driver was driving through the city when he spotted three girls standing by the side of the road with their hands raised. It looked like they were trying to flag him down. It had been a quiet night and business was slow, so he was glad to have some customers. The taxi driver pulled over, stopped, and tried to pick them up. "Where are you girls going?" he asked as they jumped in the back seat. They told him that they needed to go to the hospital. One of the girls had had a pain in her stomach, and she wanted to see a doctor. The taxi driver glanced at the girl and noticed that she was doubled over in pain. Her face seemed to be very pale, and she was crying extremely hard. The taxi driver realized that this might be an emergency, so he drove as fast as he could to the nearest hospital. When they arrived, the taxi driver looked back and saw that the girl was now extremely sick. She seemed to be sweating profusely and moaning in agony. The other girls told him they wanted to stay with their friend and begged him to go inside and fetch a doctor. The taxi driver nodded his head, jumped out of the car quickly, and ran over to the hospital's front desk. He found a nurse and immediately told her that he had a very sick girl in his taxi. He asked her if she could go have a look at her to make sure she was all right. The nurse agreed and went out to where the taxi was parked, leaving the taxi driver waiting at the front desk. Just a few minutes later, the nurse came running back into the front desk, screaming, and her face was dark red. "What is going on here?" she demanded. The taxi driver had no idea what she was talking about. "What did you do to those girls?" cried the nurse. What do you mean?" asked the bewildered taxi driver. "I've already called the police," said the nurse. "You better stay here until they arrive. Maybe you can explain to them why you have 3 dead bodies in your car." According to the nurse, 3 college girls had been driving in the area when they had a terrible accident. They were trapped in the burning wreckage, and when the ambulance brought them to the hospital, there was little the doctors could do for them. In spite of all their efforts, all 3 of the girls died. Their bodies had then been placed in the hospital mortuary. However, the dead bodies in the taxi were unmistakably those of the 3 college girls. "What were you trying to do by stealing the bodies from our hospital?" the furious nurse demanded to know. "I assure you," replied the shaken taxi driver, "when I picked those girls up, they were very, very much alive." Needless to say, the place where the taxi driver picked up the girls was in the exact same location where the accident had happened, and the girls were burned alive. Every summer, my mother would take me to visit our relatives who lived out in the country. My cousin and I were almost the same age, and we were always up to mischief. We spent most of our days out in the fields, exploring the area, making bows and arrows, sharpening our knives on rocks, throwing rocks, climbing trees, and pretending that we could track wild animals. One day, we set out on a long walk across the fields, not really having any idea where we were going. Sometimes we like to get ourselves lost and then try to find our way back home. After a few hours of walking, it was getting late in the afternoon when we came across a farmhouse that looked as if it was abandoned. On the property, there was a small storage shed, so we jumped over the fence and decided to take a look and see if we could find out what was inside. When we got there, we found that the doors were locked. There was a small keyhole, but we couldn't see through it because it was blocked by dust and thick spider webs. We turned and we walked towards the house, and we noticed that the front door was standing open, but there were no signs of life coming from within. The yard was completely overgrown with grass and weeds, and the only sound that we could hear was an old windmill nearby, rattling in the breeze. I felt really brave, so I went up to the door of the house and I shouted in, "Hello!" But there was no answer. It was just then that the smell hit me. It was a stench of damp, mold, and decay. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. There were clothes and papers everywhere, and some cardboard boxes. There was also an old bed, some racks of moth-eaten clothes, and a leather armchair. I took a few steps forward into the house, and the smell seemed to get worse. A feeling of intense uneasiness washed over me, and I wanted to turn around and run away. But again, I was feeling brave, and if I recall correctly, I think that I had already been boasting about how I was the one that had the most bravery out of the two of us. Just then, something caught my eye. At the foot of the bed, between some old boxes, it looked like a human head. It was covered in gray hair. I got a little closer. Yeah, that was a human head. There was an old man lying on his back. His face was turned upwards and his eyes were open. He was clearly quite dead. I let out a horrified yell, and then I grabbed my cousin by the arm, and we both ran as fast as we could. As we fled across the yard, we were passing the shed outside when the locked door suddenly crashed open, and an old lady was standing there. Her hair was in crazy disarray, and when she smiled, her lips parted, revealing a row of rotten teeth, and it looked like she held a bloody knife in her hand. She made a pretty good attempt to grab me as we rushed past, but I managed to dodge her and we kept running. I didn't dare to look back. I just ran and ran as fast as I could. It was a few minutes later that I realized my cousin wasn't with me. I slowed from running to a fast jog, and I turned around, and I couldn't see my cousin anywhere. I felt like I was far enough away, and I couldn't see anything, so I stopped. I was breathing extremely heavily, and I looked around. My cousin was nowhere to be seen. My heart sank. I started running again, desperately trying to get back to my aunt and my uncle's house as quickly as possible. After what seemed to be quite a long time of running non-stop, I saw the lights of their house in the distance. As soon as I reached the home, I ran inside and I called out to my mother. My relatives all gathered around as they could tell that I was distressed, and I started babbling and I begged them to go find my cousin. My uncle got into his truck and brought me with him. Eventually, we found the old farmhouse, but my cousin wasn't there. Neither was the body of the old man or the old woman. After searching for a while longer, my uncle called the police. A few days later, my cousin still had not been found. The farm was searched from top to bottom, but there was no trace of him, and he remains missing to this very day. It's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in our region. I hate myself for thinking this, but I don't know what happened to my cousin that day. I'm just glad that it didn't happen to me. There was a young woman who was never lucky in love. Every boyfriend she had either mistreated her or cheated on her. She was beginning to think that she would never find a husband and worried that she would spend the rest of her life alone. Then one day, she met a young man who just swept her off of her feet. He was kind, he was gentle, and he was caring and understanding. They began dating, and they gradually fell in love. When he asked her to marry him, the young woman was delighted, and she immediately accepted. After their wedding had taken place, the couple moved into a little house in the suburbs, and together they began making a life for themselves. They had to work hard in order to make their payments, but they didn't mind because they had each other. The young woman was delighted with her life and thought her happiness would never end. One night, she was waiting for her husband to come home from work. It was getting later and later, and when he still hadn't arrived, the woman began to get worried. She called his mobile phone, but there was no answer. She left him a couple of voicemails and sent a few text messages. Eventually, she grew tired, and she decided to go into bed, watch TV, and wait for him. As she unintentionally drifted off to sleep, The woman had a horrible nightmare. In the dream, she saw her husband riding his motorcycle down a darkened road. Suddenly, he swerved into the path of oncoming traffic and crashed directly into a truck. In her dream, she watched in horror as the motorcycle skidded along the road and the truck ran over her husband's body. In the twisted wreckage, she saw his mangled corpse lying in a pool of blood. At this point, she woke up in a cold sweat, and her heart was beating fast, nearly out of her chest. "Oh my God," she cried. "He's dead, he's dead." Sitting up in bed, she tried to calm herself down. Looking at the clock on her bedside table, she realized it was a little after midnight. Just then, she heard the familiar sound of her husband's motorcycle pulling into the driveway. As she listened closely, she heard the front door open and her husband's cheerful voice telling her that he was home. He started to explain why he was coming back so late, but the woman interrupted him. "You're really late," she shouted from the bedroom. "Why didn't you even call me? I was so worried. I thought that you died in an accident." When she had stopped talking, there was nothing but an eerie silence. She strained her ears to listen. Then, she heard her husband say in a faint voice, "So, you've made your choice then." Again, all she could hear was silence. The woman called her husband's name again, but there was no reply. She got out of bed and went downstairs, but the house was completely empty. Her husband was nowhere to be seen. Minutes later, she was startled as her phone rang. When she answered it, there was a policeman on the other end. "Mrs. Tanaka? Mrs. Tanaka? This is Constable Jinsu. I'm sorry to be the one to inform you," he said. "But just an hour ago, your husband was killed in a motorcycle accident." "10 years ago, my sister ran away from home. In all of this time, she's never contacted us. We didn't know if she was alive or dead. And then one night, she came back. When she came home, I was the only one in the house because my parents had gone out for the evening. My sister seemed to be scared of something because she kept shaking and trembling. She was clinging to me and kept saying, 'Please don't leave me alone. Please don't leave me alone. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back.' She was in a state of sheer panic, so I brought her upstairs to her old bedroom. My parents had kept it exactly the same as it was on the day that she ran away. I got her to lay down on her bed. 'Calm down, calm down, calm down. Please calm down. I'll bring you something to drink, okay?' I thought that this might calm her down, but when I tried to leave the room, my sister started crying. 'Don't go, please don't go. I'm scared. The moment I stepped out of the room, the door slammed shut behind me, seemingly on its own accord. I heard my sister's voice screaming from inside the room. 'The blue people are coming! The blue people are coming! The blue people are coming!' When I finally managed to force the door open, my sister was gone. I searched the closet. I searched under the bed. I looked in the wardrobe and even in the attic, but there was no trace of her anywhere. All that remained were her tattered shoes, standing by the front door. One moment she was here, and the next she was gone. I called my parents and I told them what happened. I'm certain that it wasn't a dream. She just disappeared. A teenage girl named Rosemary attended a high school in a small city in Canada. One day, her biology teacher announced that he was taking the entire class on a school trip. Everyone was delighted. A couple of days later, a bus brought all the students to a remote part of the countryside. The purpose of the trip was, of course, educational. The teacher told them that they were going to explore a nature trail. As they walked along the trail, Rosemary was enjoying the fresh air and the time off from sitting at her desk inside the school. She was chatting happily to her best friend, Amanda. The two girls were caught up in conversation, and they began to start lagging behind the rest of the group. Somewhere along the way, they took a wrong turn and became separated from the rest of the group. The girls kept walking, hoping that they would eventually meet up with the rest of the class, but instead, they just seemed to become more and more lost. Eventually, they came to a small pathway and were relieved when they saw that it led to a little cottage set back amongst the trees. The walls of the cottage were covered with ivy and the garden was overgrown. The doors and the windows looked like they hadn't been painted in decades. When the girls knocked on the door, a little old lady came out to greet them. She was very frail and stooped with age. They asked her if they could use her phone. The old woman invited them in and offered them a cup of tea. The two girls were very tired and scared and accepted her offer without hesitation. Inside, this cottage was dirty and grimy. The floor was muddy and the fireplace was covered in soot. The old woman told them to sit down, and for some reason, as she hurried out of the kitchen, she said, "Keep your eyes shut." The girls wondered what she meant by that last comment. Curious, they looked around the room, and their eyes settled on a large mirror that was standing in the corner. Somehow, they couldn't seem to take their eyes off of the mirror, and they just sat there, quietly staring at their own reflections. In the mirror, their faces appeared strange and distorted, and it looked as if their cheeks were covered with scratches. They couldn't seem to tear their eyes away from the unsettling image. As they watched in horror, their faces began to change rapidly. More scratches appeared, followed by large bruises and bleeding wounds. Even though they seemed to be in a trance, the two girls had a very bad feeling about this. Just then, Amanda was able to turn her head, and Rosemary saw something that terrified her. In the reflection, she saw that Amanda had a sharp knife sticking out of her eye, and that her own face looked as if it had been crushed. Both girls were able to suddenly regain movement. They covered their eyes with their hands, jumped up, started shaking and screaming. The old woman began yelling and came hobbling back into the room as quickly as she could. And when she looked at the two girls, she growled, "I told you to keep your eyes closed." Without another word, Rosemary and Amanda jumped to their feet and ran out of the house. They kept running, crashing through bushes and jumping over streams, not knowing where they were going, but sure that they needed to be far away from that house. Eventually, they saw the school bus in the distance and they breathed a sigh of relief. Their classmates were surprised to see the two girls come running across the fields. The teacher was quite angry with them and told the girls that they had kept everybody waiting for over an hour. Rosemary and Amanda were just glad to be back with their classmates again. The school trip was over, so all the students climbed on board and the bus drove off. By the next day, the two girls had almost forgotten about their scary incident with the old woman in the little cottage. However, exactly 1 week later, Rosemary and Amanda were found dead in their beds. Their sheets were stained with blood, and their bodies were covered in scratches, bruises, and deep wounds. One day while my parents were out, I was babysitting my little brother. We were alone in the house and we decided to play a game of hide and seek. I closed my eyes and I counted to 20 while my brother ran off to hide. When I'd finished counting, I started looking for my brother. I couldn't find him anywhere. Eventually, I went into my parents' bedroom, and I noticed that the door of their closet was standing ajar. "I know you're in there," I shouted as I pulled the door open. The bedroom closet was crammed full of clothes, and when I thrust my hand into it, another hand immediately reached out from inside and grabbed me by the wrist. "Come on, I found you," I cried, trying to pull him out. Come on out of there." But he wouldn't come out, no matter how hard I pulled or how much I yelled. He was hiding behind all the clothes, and he didn't speak a word. I started wondering what was wrong with him. Just then, I heard a voice behind me ask, "What are you doing?" I turned my head slightly, and I was shocked to see my little brother standing in the doorway of the bedroom. Looking back, I realized the pale, white hand was still holding on to my wrist. I screamed as loud as I could, and I felt my entire body go ice cold. I began to panic as I desperately tried to shake myself free of the death grip that this hand had on me. My brother rushed over to help me, and eventually I managed to squirm out of the clutches of that pale white hand. My brother and I ran screaming from the room, and we rushed out of the house. There we stood in the street together, trembling, and we waited for our parents to return. When they finally came home, we told them what had happened, and they went upstairs to search the bedroom closet. Of course, they found nothing inside, just a bunch of old clothes and boxes. One night, an 8-year-old girl was sitting at home, watching television with her mother. Suddenly, the screen began flickering, and the image of a ghostly woman in red inexplicably appeared on the TV. She was holding a small sign that was covered with words scrawled in red ink. The sign read, "This is a special announcement. Parents, please send your children to bed immediately." This worried the mother, and she found it very strange, so she told her daughter to go to bed. The young girl protested, but the mother remained firm. She grabbed her daughter by the arm and led her into the hallway. Then the girl meekly walked up the stairs to her bedroom, and the mother returned to the living room. When she looked at the TV again, the woman on the screen was holding a new message. It read, "Please wait." Just as you have done right now, the mother sat waiting patiently on her sofa, waiting for the special announcement. After 5 minutes passed and nothing happened, though she was intrigued, she began to get bored. Just then, the woman on the screen displayed a new message. The writing was tiny and it was very, very difficult to read. The mother had to get up off of the couch and inch closer to the TV in order to make out the words. Once she was close enough to be able to read the words, she saw that the sign read, "Thank you. Your children are now dead." The mother was instantly terrified. She ran upstairs and burst into her daughter's bedroom. She found the young girl lying in bed with the covers pulled up to her neck and breathed a sigh of relief. As she watched her daughter sleeping, the mother had a strange feeling that something was wrong. The blankets on the bed were not moving. It appeared that her daughter wasn't breathing. Slowly and filled with immense dread, she walked over to the girl's bedside and pulled down the covers. She recoiled in horror and began screaming. On the pillow lay her daughter's severed head. Her body was nowhere to be found. There are many superstitions in Mexico. Some of these ancient beliefs have been passed down from generation to generation, and others are followed because of warnings from elders and past experiences. One well-known superstition is that you should never make plans with friends or family outdoors in the dark of night. The reason for this, the older folks say, is that there are always things lurking in the darkness, listening and waiting for the perfect opportunity to trick you, take advantage of you, and possibly to destroy you. This is a story about something that happened to my grandfather when he was a young man. His name was Jose, and he was just 20 years old at the time. He was working as a fisherman in the small coastal village where he was born. He still lived with his mother, and his girlfriend, Raven, lived just down the street from him. Her family owned a small boat and fished in the same area as Jose fished. One night, after finishing work, he met Raven, and they went out for a quiet drink together. When the bar closed down, they decided to head home, and their journey took them by an old cemetery. As they made their way down the lonely country road, there was only the light of the moon to guide them in the darkness. When they reached Jose's house, he said to his girlfriend, "Hey, Raven, let's leave a little early tomorrow so we can cast our nets out before everyone else gets to the shore." "Well, that's a good idea," Raven replied. "We can leave around 5 a.m. tomorrow while it's still dark. I'll come to the front yard to pick you up, so be ready to go when I call you." "All right, I'll see you in the morning," said my Grandpa Jose as he kissed her goodnight. They parted, waved to each other, and they went their separate ways. Early the next morning, Jose was awoken by the sound of someone calling his name. "Hey, Jose, wake up, let's go." Jose dragged himself out of bed and he looked out the window. He saw Raven standing in the front yard staring up at him. When he glanced at the clock, he saw that it was 4:30 a.m. "You're early," he called. "All right, just give me a minute." "Hurry up," shouted Raven. "It'll be bright soon." Jose quickly dressed and grabbed his things. When he ran downstairs and opened the front door, he saw that Raven was already walking down the road. "Hey, wait for me," called Jose anxiously. But Raven didn't turn around. She just kept on walking. Jose ran after her and tried to catch up with her, but then Raven started running too. He thought that this was really strange behavior, and when he slowed down, so did Raven. But she never looked back, she never talked to him, and there was always the same amount of distance between the two of them. Eventually, they neared their favorite spot for fishing, which was only a few minutes away. To get there, they had to cross a deep trench with a narrow bridge across it. When Raven came to the middle of the bridge, she suddenly stopped and stood very still. Her back was to Jose, and he couldn't see her face. For some reason, as the story goes, my grandpa got a weird feeling in the pit of his stomach. I guess something felt wrong to him. Raven was acting very strange, and he was afraid to get on the bridge at the same time as she was. So he called out to her, and he told her to go on ahead, saying that he needed to stop and tie his shoelace. As Jose bent down to tie his shoe, Raven turned around to face him, and that's when he saw it. She was grinning from ear to ear, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile he had never ever seen on his girlfriend's face before. It was as if all of her features were twisted into an evil grimace. All of a sudden, Raven's smile grew even more maniacal, and she threw herself off the side of the narrow bridge. My grandpa got to his feet and simply stared in shock. He didn't know what to do. He was so stunned that he could barely believe what he had just seen happen. Right then, he heard Raven screaming, "Jose, help me! Please help me!" Instinctively, he ran towards the bridge and peered over the edge. He couldn't see her anywhere. "Raven, where are you?" he cried out desperately. "I can't see you! Where are you?" He just kept hearing Raven's voice screaming, "Help me! Please help me!" As the story goes, my grandfather was about to jump into the trench to save his girlfriend when something made him stop in his tracks. He hadn't noticed it until now, But in between Raven's screams, he could hear what sounded like laughter. It sounded like she was laughing in between her screams. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It seemed maniacal and mischievous, almost diabolical. Jose felt the blood freeze in his veins. He began to shake like a leaf, and he backed away from the bridge. Something inside of him told him that he was in great danger, and this instinct made him turn around and run in the opposite direction. He dashed down the road back toward his house as fast as he could. Jose was so scared that he ran straight into his house and went upstairs to wake his mother. She was lying in bed, and when she saw Jose's pale face, she could tell that something was extremely wrong. She noted that Jose could hardly speak. He was overwhelmed by fear and by guilt. He couldn't help feeling that he may have left his girlfriend to drown back there. "What is wrong, Jose? What is wrong?" asked his mother. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I don't know, Mama," he whispered. "I think something horrible has happened to Raven." His mother hugged him tightly as he cried on her shoulder. Just then, he heard a voice calling him from the yard. "Hey, Jose, wake up. Let's go." Jose and his mother got up and looked out the window. They both saw Raven standing in the front yard, staring up at him. When he glanced at the clock, he saw that it was 5:10 a.m. Raven wiped the hair away from her face, gave a strange smile, and said, "I'm sorry that I'm late." Ah ha ha. Yes, back to the short, scary stories. We love these so much. It reminds us of the ghost stories and campfire stories we would hear when we were children. We hope that you enjoy these as well, as they bring us immense pleasure. Hopefully none of them were too scary for any of you. If so, everything will be okay. Just lock your doors, go to your room, pull your covers up tight, try to go to sleep, and try to have sweet dreams.